The day my daughter called me crying so hard she couldn't get a full sentence out, I was sitting on my back porch in Georgia, drinking my second cup of coffee and watching the sun come up over the tree line. I was 63 years old, retired from 30 years with the county roads department, and I had been telling myself for months that things in her house were going to work themselves out. That morning I stopped telling myself that. Her name is Denise. She's my youngest. She has her mother's eyes and her mother's stubbornness. And when her mother passed 8 years ago, Denise took it harder than any of us. I think that's part of why she held on to that man the way she did. When you lose somebody who was your whole anchor, you reach for whatever's closest. She reached for Harlan. I didn't like Harlan from the first time she brought him home. I want to be honest about that, because some people would say I'm just a protective father, and I would have found fault with any man she chose. That's not true. I liked her first boyfriend in high school, a quiet kid named Terrell, who treated her like she hung the moon. I liked the man she dated in her late 20s, a school teacher who made her laugh in a way I hadn't heard since before her mother got sick. Harlan was different. There was something in the way he stood in my kitchen the first time, hands in his pockets, eyes moving around the room like he was taking inventory, that put me on edge. I couldn't explain. I told myself I was being unfair. I told myself to give the man a chance. Denise married him in the spring 2 years after they met. The wedding was small. She seemed happy. I stood at the altar next to her and I held it together because that was what she needed from me that day. The trouble started quietly, the way it always does with men like Harlan. The first thing I noticed was that Denise stopped calling as much. We used to talk every Sunday morning, same as I used to talk to her mother. Then the calls got shorter. Then she started calling on different days, random days, like she was picking moments when she had a window. When I asked her about it, she said she'd been busy, said Harlan liked to spend Sunday mornings together as a couple, said it in this careful voice that I recognized. It was the voice she used when she was managing me. When she didn't want me to push. I didn't push. I should have. About 8 months into the marriage, my grandson was born. They named him Tobias, Harlan's choice. I drove up to the hospital in Macon the day after he came into the world, and I held that little boy and I looked at my daughter lying in that bed looking exhausted, but trying to smile, and I made a promise to myself that whatever happened, that child was going to have somebody steady in his corner. The visits became complicated after Tobias was born. Every time I drove up, there was some reason it wasn't a good time. Harlan was working nights and needed to sleep. Harlan had his own mother coming to visit. Harlan had plans for the family that weekend. I started calling ahead a week in advance, 2 weeks, like I was scheduling a dentist appointment to see my own daughter and grandchild. Half the time something came up at the last minute, and I'd be sitting in my truck in their driveway getting a text from Denise saying she was sorry, could we reschedule? I want you to understand something. I am not a man who makes scenes. I am not a man who shows up uninvited and starts hollering on the front porch. I was raised better than that. And beyond that, I knew in my gut that making things difficult for Denise would only make things harder for her after I left. So I kept my mouth shut. I drove home. I sat on my back porch and I prayed and I waited. The call came on a Tuesday in November. She was crying so hard she kept losing her breath. I could hear Tobias in the background. He must have been about 14 months old by then, fussing the way toddlers do when they feel something is wrong in the house. I kept saying, "Denise, slow down, baby. Talk to me." And slowly, in pieces, it came out. Harlan had come home the night before in a mood. She didn't know why. She said sometimes there was no reason she could identify. He just came in carrying something dark with him, and anything could set it off. She'd been trying to get Tobias to sleep, and he was being difficult the way babies are. And Harlan came into the room and told her to shut that baby up. She told him to lower his voice. He grabbed her by the arm and shoved her into the doorframe hard enough to leave a bruise that ran from her shoulder down to her elbow. That was not the first time. She told me that morning that it had been happening for almost a year. Small things at first. A grip too hard here, a shove there. Once he grabbed her face in both hands and squeezed until she saw spots. She had been hiding it. She had been hiding it from me, from her sister, from everyone, because she was ashamed and because she was afraid and because Harlan had done what men like him always do. He had spent months telling her that she was lucky to have him, that no one else would want a woman with a child, that if she ever said a word to her family, he would make sure she never saw Tobias again. I was so quiet on that phone that she asked me if I was still there. I said, "I'm here, baby. I'm right here." And I meant it in every way. Those words can mean I told her to pack what she could for herself and for Tobias, and to call me when Harlan left for work the next morning. I told her we were going to fix this. She started crying again, different this time. Not panic, but relief. And that sound nearly broke me in half. That night, I made 2 calls. The first was to my brother Lawrence. Lawrence is 59, a year younger than me, and the reason I am going to tell you about him is because it matters to the rest of this story. Lawrence and I are close in the way that only brothers who have been through hard things together can be close. We look alike. We sound alike. If you put us side by side, most people can tell us apart because I've got a scar over my left eyebrow from a farming accident when I was 12. But if you're not looking closely, and most people don't look closely, we pass for each other without much effort. Lawrence drove down from Alabama the next morning and was at my house by noon. The second call I made that night was to a friend of mine named Carl, who spent 20 years as a county sheriff's deputy before he retired. I told Carl what was happening and I asked him what I needed to know. He talked to me for an hour. I took notes on a yellow legal pad. When I hung up, I had a plan. Denise called me at 7:45 the next morning. Harlan had left for work. She had Tobias's bag packed and her own bag packed, and she was standing in the kitchen shaking. I told her to take a breath. I told her she was doing the right thing. I told her we'd be there in 2 hours. Lawrence drove. I sat in the passenger seat with my legal pad on my knee and my phone in my hand, and I thought about everything Carl had told me. Georgia law on domestic violence. What a protective order requires. What constitutes evidence. I had already looked up the nearest DV advocate office in the county, and I had the number saved. When we got to Denise's house, I saw my daughter for the first time in almost 2 months, and the bruise on her arm had turned yellow and green at the edges, which meant it was older than the one she told me about. I hugged her and I held on and I felt her whole body shaking against me, and I kept it together because that was what she needed from me in that moment. We had Denise and Tobias in the truck and most of what they needed within 40 minutes. Lawrence was a rock. He carried things. He kept Tobias occupied with a set of toy keys he'd had the foresight to bring. He didn't say much. That was Lawrence. When it mattered, he showed up and he got quiet and he worked. Denise and Tobias came to stay with me in Georgia. I set up the back bedroom for her and put a little toddler bed next to mine for Tobias, who I don't think fully understood what was happening, but seemed to sense the change in his mother. He slept better at my house than she said he'd been sleeping in months. The problem was Harlan. He came home to an empty house and he called her phone 64 times that evening. I counted. She didn't answer. He texted things that I will not repeat here, because this is not that kind of story. But I want you to know they were bad enough that I took screenshots of every single one and sent them to Carl. Then Harlan drove to her sister's house in Atlanta. Then he drove to her cousin's house in Columbus. He was looking for her. He didn't know to look at my house. Denise told me she had never told Harlan where exactly I lived. He knew I was in Georgia, knew it was rural, but she had never given him the specific address. She had been doing that on purpose. Some instinct in her had been protecting that information for a long time. That detail, that small careful thing she had done without even fully knowing why she did it, is part of what made the rest possible. 3 days after Denise came to stay with me, Harlan found out where I lived. I still don't know exactly how. My best guess is he looked through old letters at their house or went through her email on the laptop she left behind. Point is, he showed up. He didn't come alone. He brought his older brother Royce and their mother Paulette. I want you to understand the kind of people we are talking about. Royce was a big man, broad across the shoulders, with a way of standing that was meant to take up space and make you feel like you needed to account for it. Paulette was in her mid-60s, small and thin, but she had a tongue on her that she had clearly been sharpening her whole life. She was the one who had raised Harlan to be what he was. I know that because Denise told me later about the things she'd witnessed in that family. The way Paulette spoke to men who didn't fall in line. The way she taught her sons that a woman who doesn't comply is a woman who doesn't respect you. The whole ugly architecture of it. Harlan didn't come out of nowhere. He came out of that. They pulled up in Royce's truck on a Thursday afternoon. Here is what they didn't know. Lawrence had gone back to Alabama that morning. Denise and Tobias were not at my house. I'd driven them to stay with Carl and his wife, 2 towns over, just for the day because Carl had suggested it. He said, if things go the way I think they might, you don't want your daughter and that baby anywhere near the property. Carl was right. What they also didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Lawrence had driven back. He'd gotten about an hour down the road toward Alabama, turned around and come back without calling me. He said later that something told him to come back, some feeling he couldn't shake. He pulled his car around to the far side of my barn, where it wasn't visible from the driveway, and he came in through the back door and he said, "What do you need me to do?" I told him. When Harlan knocked on my front door that afternoon, it was Lawrence who answered it. Now, I need you to understand something. I was standing in the hallway behind a mostly closed door, watching through a 2-inch gap. Lawrence had my old gray cardigan on, the one I wear when I'm home in the afternoons. He was standing in my doorway, in my house, and from where Harlan was standing, in the afternoon light, looking at a man his wife's father's age with my build and my face. There was no reason for him to think he was looking at anyone other than who he thought he was looking at. Harlan started in right away. He wanted to know where Denise was. Lawrence said he didn't know what Harlan was talking about. Harlan said he knew she was here, said she was his wife, said Lawrence. Said I, the person he thought he was talking to, had no right to involve myself in their marriage. Lawrence kept his voice even. He said he hadn't seen Denise. He said maybe Harlan ought to try calling her. That's when Royce stepped up onto the porch. He got up in Lawrence's face, and Royce was a head taller and probably 60 pounds heavier, and he said some things that I'm going to keep between this story and the people who were there that day. Then he shoved Lawrence. Not a push, a shove. Both hands on the chest, hard enough that Lawrence had to catch himself on the doorframe. Royce made a mistake that day. Because Lawrence is not me. I'm the calm one. Lawrence spent 6 years in the army before he came home and went to work. Lawrence has a stillness about him that you should not confuse for gentleness. What happened next was brief, and it was decisive. I am not going to give you a play-by-play because that's not the point of this story, but I will tell you that Royce came onto my property and put his hands on my brother, and by the time it was over, Royce was sitting on the ground next to his own truck, trying to remember what state he was in. Harlan had backed all the way down the porch steps. Paulette was screaming from the passenger window. And here is where the plan mattered. Because I had called the county sheriff's office before they arrived, not to report something that had happened, to report something I believed was about to happen, based on 64 missed calls and a string of threatening text messages that I had already provided to the dispatch officer as documentation. Carl had advised me on exactly how to make that call, and what to say. By the time Lawrence and Royce were done, there were 2 patrol cars coming down my driveway. The responding deputies had already been briefed. They had the screenshots. They had the record of the calls. They had a statement from Denise, which she had given to a diva advocate the day before, documenting 11 months of physical abuse with dates and descriptions as specific as she could remember them. Harlan was detained at the scene. Royce was charged with assault. He had shoved Lawrence in the doorway of a private residence. And the fact that he had done it thinking he was shoving a 63-year-old retired county roads worker did not make the charge go away. Paulette sat in that truck and didn't say another word. I walked out onto my porch after the deputies had done what they needed to do, and I looked at Harlan sitting in the back of that patrol car, and he looked back at me through the window. I don't know what he saw. I wasn't angry anymore, I can tell you that. What I felt was something quieter than anger. Certainty, maybe. The kind that comes when something you have been dreading for a long time is finally just a thing that happened. I called Carl and told him it was done. Carl called Denise. She called me about 15 minutes later. She was crying, but it was the same kind of crying as that first morning on the phone. Not panic, not fear, relief. The kind that goes all the way down. I picked her and Tobias up from Carl's house that evening. Tobias fell asleep in his car seat before we got back on the highway. Denise sat in the passenger seat watching the road, and after a long time she said, "Daddy, I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner." I said, "Baby, you told me when you were ready." And then I said what I needed to say, what I'd been thinking about since the morning she called. "You did nothing wrong, not a thing. I need you to hold on to that." She got a protective order. Harlan's court date was set. I hired a family law attorney in Macon who had 30 years of experience with cases like this, and Carl recommended a criminal attorney for the assault charges. I paid for both of them. I know some people would say that's not my place, that she's a grown woman and she can handle her own affairs, and I understand that position. But here is my position. She's my daughter. Tobias is my grandson. And when I am still standing and still able, I will stand between my family and whatever is coming at them. That's not control. That's love with its work boots on. Denise and Tobias stayed with me for 4 months. In that time, she got a job at a medical billing company that let her work from home. She enrolled Tobias in a little play group at the church in town 3 mornings a week. She started sleeping through the night again. I watched her come back to herself slowly. The way things grow in winter, you don't see it happening. But then one morning there's something green where there wasn't before. In the spring, she found a house to rent in a town about 40 minutes from me, close enough to come to Sunday dinner, far enough to have her own life. The morning she moved in, Lawrence drove down from Alabama and helped us carry boxes and furniture, and Tobias's small collection of plastic animals that had multiplied somehow during the months at my house. We ordered pizza and ate it on the floor of her new living room because the table hadn't been set up yet, and Tobias ate half a slice of cheese pizza with the absolute seriousness of a person conducting important business. And I sat there in that empty room with my brother and my daughter and my grandson, and I thought about my wife, about how much she would have loved to see this moment, and I let myself feel that for a minute, and then I let it go. Some months later, I heard through a mutual acquaintance that Harlan had taken a plea deal. The details of the charges against him had become a matter of record. Royce paid a fine and did community service. I don't know what became of Paulette, and I don't spend much time thinking about it. What I think about is Tobias, who is 3.5 now, and who calls me Pop, and who has a way of finding whatever I'm working on in the garage, and standing next to me watching with the same solemn attention his mother had as a little girl. I think about Denise driving down on Sunday mornings, the calls we have now, long ones, the way she laughs, the way she sounds like herself again. I think about Lawrence, who turned around on the road to Alabama because something told him to, and what might have been different if he hadn't. I think about the look on Harlan's face through the window of that patrol car, and I think about how he came to my door that afternoon expecting to find an old man who could be pushed around. He was not entirely wrong about the old man part. I am 63 years old, and I creak in the mornings, and I take 3 prescriptions, and I can't work as hard or as long as I could at 40. But here is what Harlan never understood about me. What men like him never seemed to understand. It was never about me. When you come for my family, I don't need to be the strongest man in the room. I need to be the most prepared. And I had been preparing, one way or another, since the morning my daughter called me and couldn't get a full sentence out. You don't attack something a man has spent his whole life building and expect him to stand aside. You just don't. He thought he could take everything from her. He thought that because she was alone, she was without protection. He did not know what she was carrying with her, quiet and invisible, her whole married life. The knowledge that somewhere in Georgia, an old man with a scar over his left eyebrow was sitting on a back porch, drinking his coffee and waiting for the call. She made it. And we were ready